Welcome back to the deep dive. If you're looking for, well, a shortcut to understanding some really complex and maybe provocative arguments shaping things today, you're definitely in the right place. Today, we are strapping in for a pretty deep, challenging, and let's be honest, highly controversial dive into the limits of personal liberty. Our source material comes from these extensive excerpts of a manifesto called The Case for Unrestricted Liberty. And when we say unrestricted, we really mean it. The author, who we'll call Rose here, is basically advocating for a framework of near absolute personal and economic freedom, drawing some very bright, very hard lines around what's allowed and what's strictly forbidden. So our mission today is pretty critical. We need to impartially unpack this core distinction the author keeps coming back to, the difference between, say, personal condemnation, which is totally allowed, even encouraged as a kind of social penalty,
Right.
and physical or governmental coercion, which is just never allowed. We're going to focus specifically on where this framework draws the line for free speech, free association, and, importantly, where the sources claim the government subtly crosses that line.
Yeah, and it's really crucial we frame this for you, the listener, right at the start. The sources we're digging into today are, well, they're radical compared to mainstream political thinking, pretty much across the board. The central idea, the thesis, is that liberty has to extend specifically to protecting opinions and actions that others find offensive, maybe even distasteful. This isn't about finding common ground or building consensus. It's more like a manual for maximizing individual choice, pure and simple. So our role today is purely to understand the logic and maybe the ruthless consistency of this very specific, restrictive, non-coercive framework, even when, its applications lead to outcomes many people would find, well, morally repugnant.
Okay, let's unpack this right away then. Let's set the fundamental ground rules. We'll start with Section 1, establishing the core doctrine. And that doctrine is nonviolence as the only limit. So the first thing that really defines this whole framework is the author's pretty radical premise about free speech. When most people think about free speech, they usually think about, the right to say something generally accepted or maybe something a bit unpopular but still polite. This source just completely turns that on its head.
It really does. It's almost an inverted definition. The argument here is very selective, focused purely on the protection mechanism. The source says it plainly. If speech is agreeable, it doesn't need protection. Why would you need a fundamental right to express an opinion everyone already agrees with? It's just redundant, right?
Right. No need to protect what isn't threatened.
Exactly. So the whole point, the entire utility and historical purpose of freedom of speech, according to this author, is explicitly not about protecting polite or agreeable opinions. Its entire value comes from protecting speech that the majority, or maybe the government, finds offensive, distasteful, or maybe even dangerous. It's basically a defense of the fringes, the deeply unpopular.
It really shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from the content of the speech and onto the necessity for protection. It suggests, like you said, if you only protect speech everyone likes, you haven't actually secured liberty. You've just enforced politeness. But okay, this immediately makes you ask about the limits. If the content doesn't matter, where does Rose draw that hard line?
The line is absolute, and it's singular. Violence and coercion. That brings us to the core idea here, the violence versus criticism dichotomy. The central rule laid down is totally uncompromising. Violence or initiating force is never justified in response to speech, no matter how offensive that speech is. Never, according to this framework. Conversely, things like condemnation, criticism, ridicule, those are always justified responses to speech you don't like.
Okay, that's a very clear philosophical line, but it feels a bit high level. I want to push on that with some, real-world friction. How does the source handle things that aren't physical violence but still feel coercive, like fraud or theft? Those don't involve hitting someone, but they definitely harm their freedom, their property.
That's a really crucial question for understanding the logic here, and the source does address it. It distinguishes between speech or criticism on one hand and physical or economic aggression on the other. So acts like theft or fraud, they get categorized as the initiation of coercion. Why? Because they involve the forceful, non-consensual taking of property, or maybe the deliberate deception needed to achieve that taking. In this framework, your right to property is seen as just as fundamental as your right to speech. So violating that property right through theft or fraud isn't just words, it's a physical or economic act of coercion.
So the dichotomy holds. Speech is non-coercive, but fraud is coercive. It's about the mechanism of harm.
Exactly. Speech allows a response of more speech or criticism or disassociation, all nonviolent, non-coercive things. but it never, ever permits a response involving physical force or using the state to seize assets or punish someone.
So can you just nail down that distinction again? Valid responses versus coercion. What's allowed versus what's forbidden?
Sure. We need to be really clear about the allowed social responses. These include things like harsh condemnation, ridicule, even public shaming, and crucially, disassociation.
Disassociation meaning.
Meaning voluntarily refusing to interact, refusing to hire someone, refusing to sell to someone, refusing to invite them to your party, whatever. These are seen as voluntary consequences happening within the sphere of liberty.
Okay, and the invalid responses.
Invalid responses are anything involving initiating physical force like assault or using government coercion. That means passing a law that bans the speech, or financially punishing the speaker through fines or taxes imposed by the state.
It sounds like the source is basically arguing for this, I don't know, chaotic but ultimately free marketplace of ideas where social consequences are the only allowed penalty. You're free to say the most horrible things you can imagine, and I'm free to absolutely hate you for it, maybe ruin your social standing, organize a private boycott. But neither of us gets to call the cops on the other or, throw a punch.
That's a perfect way to synthesize Section 1, yeah. And this strict dichotomy is absolutely paramount because, as we'll see, the author believes the biggest threats to liberty today involve blurring that line, disguising state coercion as social justice, or getting the government involved to achieve things people can't manage through just voluntary social pressure and disassociation. That boundary between the private sphere, where consequences are allowed, and the governmental sphere, where coercion is forbidden. That's the entire battleground for this author.
Okay, the stage is definitely set. Let's move on to where the sources think the government consistently fails this test. Section 2. Examining threats to speech from government. The author seems really focused on political figures who, at least in their view, try to use the state's machinery to limit speech they don't like. And it's not just about passing actual laws, right? It's also about the language they use.
Yes, they spend a lot of time on what they call the problem of weaponized terminology. The source argues that politicians often try to create legal or regulatory cover for limiting speech by using these broad, arbitrary, and emotionally charged labels. Labels that are basically impossible to define objectively.
And the prime example, the one we hear debated constantly now, is the push to ban hate speech.
Exactly. That's target number one. The source specifically criticizes political figures, Pam Bondi is mentioned among others, for pushing this idea of banning hate speech. Now, the core argument isn't about whether hateful speech exists or not. It's that the term hate speech is inherently arbitrary because hate is subjective, right? So any legal definition becomes really pliable, easily stretched. The author argues this term is specifically used to give political authorities the power to censor views that are just unpopular or maybe politically inconvenient for them.
It's that classic philosophical worry, isn't it? If the state gets to define what hate means legally, then the state effectively defines the boundaries of acceptable dissent. But how does the author connect that vague language to, well, dictatorial behavior?
They draw that link through the chilling effect. This falls under what they label censorship and dictatorial thinking. If the definition of what's prohibited speech is vague, then any authority can potentially use that vagueness to threaten critics. The source sees this not as an accident, but as an intentional effort to grant authorities discretionary power over ideas. And this ties directly in to their critique of government officials who threaten action against their critics.
And this is where the source really pulls no punches, right? Mentioning former President Trump specifically.
Correct. The author uses a pretty derogatory nickname, Mango Mussolini, for Donald Trump, and accuses him of repeatedly threatening government action against critics. A specific example cited involves targeting comedians on Saturday Night Live. Now, the key distinction here, according to Rose, isn't that Trump physically went after these comedians.
Right.
The source frames the threat itself just the suggestion of using state power, maybe FCC intervention against the broadcaster, maybe a regulatory investigation, or even punitive tax measures against critics. The threat alone is framed as outright censorship.
So the threat, just the implied willingness to use the state bureaucracy against you, that's the violation of liberty, even if nothing actually happens in the end. It's about creating an environment where people start censoring themselves out of fear.
That perfectly captures the source's argument, yes. When the person holding the most powerful office suggests they might punish you through government action because of your jokes or your criticism, the effect is immediate self-censorship for many. It moves beyond just political disagreement and enters the realm of state-backed intimidation. And they argue this mechanism of fear is used just as much by politicians on the left, maybe threatening corporations with punishment if they don't comply with certain social mandates.
Okay, so if the source argues that politicians on both sides use these kinds of government threats against critics, what does the author see as the ultimate, pure definition of true freedom? What's the ideal state they're aiming for?
The author really strips it down to the bare essentials. True freedom of speech is not getting permission to say things the authorities approve of. That kind of permission is seen as meaningless, temporary, just dependent on who happens to be in charge at the moment. Instead, freedom of speech is fundamentally, definitionally, the right to say things they hate.
Things they hate, meaning the authorities.
Yes. If the politician or the regulator or the ruling class doesn't actively detest what you're saying, then you haven't really tested your liberty. According to this source, protecting that detested speech is the only real metric for a genuinely free society.
Wow. Okay, so it's almost like a litmus test.
Yeah.
If you're comfortable with the speech, it's actually irrelevant to the principle of liberty. Only the speech that makes you recoil or makes the authorities feel personally attacked or threatened, that's the speech that actually needs protecting.
Precisely. And this consistency is what the source demands above all else. The author basically says, look, if you want the government to ban their hateful speech today, you absolutely must accept that when the political pendulum swings back, the opposition will use that exact same government power to ban your cherished speech tomorrow. The only way to secure liberty universally, in this view, is to make sure the government is completely powerless to act against any non-coercive expression, period.
This sets us up perfectly to expand these non-coercion principles beyond just pure speech into the realm of the market and social interaction. Let's move into Section 3, expanding liberty to association and business decisions. So in this section, the author brings in what they call the parallel principle, freedom of association. This idea of extending liberty from speech to our economic and social choices seems really central to the whole framework.
It's presented as the natural, logical progression of the argument. Yeah. If the fundamental liberty is the right to choose what comes out of your own mouth, then the corresponding liberty has to be the right to choose who you interact with, especially in the marketplace. Rose argues that the right to speak implies the right to listen, but also, crucially, the right not to listen, or the right not to deal with someone whose speech or conduct you find, despicable.
Okay, this brings us right into the core business angle. Voluntary disassociation versus coercion. How does this doctrine define what's acceptable business conduct based on this principle?
Well, the acceptable conduct is defined simply by the absence of state force. The source argues you have the right to choose who you work for, who you fire, who you boycott, or who you do business with. These are all seen as voluntary economic choices, protected by this principle of association. So if you decide to terminate a business relationship because you saw someone's offensive Twitter post, that's framed as a private consequence of speech, not government coercion.
Okay, let's use this specific example the source brings up to illustrate this, the Gina Carano example. Because this case often gets people arguing that private companies are acting like censors, basically doing the government's dirty work for them.
Right, and the source dissects that argument pretty carefully. In a scenario where a company, say Disney, fires an actress because of her controversial political opinions, Rose categorizes that purely as disassociation. It's not violence, it's not government coercion. Now, the author explicitly notes that observers might see the company's decision as, quote, dumb, unfair, hypocritical, or ideologically motivated. But even so, it remains a protected right of that private business to set the terms of association for its employees and, if they choose, to terminate that association based on content or conduct. The absolute key firewall here is that the government did not mandate the firing.
So wait, no matter how, maybe, egregious or unfair, the reason for firing someone seems, whether it looks like sexism or racism or just political disagreement, it's still a protected liberty under this doctrine, as long as it's a private decision made without any governmental threat or mandate behind it.
That is the philosophical position the source holds. Yes, absolutely. The consequence is social and economic, handled within the marketplace, not by the state. And this applies just as much to everyday interactions, which is covered under private rules and refusal of service.
Can you elaborate on that bit about business rules, using the specific example the author brought up?
Yeah, the source gives this interesting symmetry example involving COVID mandates back then. Rose states that private businesses setting specific rules for how they operate, like requiring customers to wear masks during the pandemic, absolutely had the right to refuse service to anyone who didn't comply.
Hmm.
And crucially, the author states very clearly that they personally viewed those specific mask rules as, quote, moronic and unnecessary. Yet the principle had to be held sacred. The business owns the property, they set the terms of service. If a customer disagrees, their remedy is simply to take their business elsewhere. Not to demand government intervention, to force the business owner to change their rules to suit the customer's preference.
That really demonstrates the kind of consistency this framework demands,
Yeah.
whether the decision seems ideologically popular or unpopular, whether it's economically smart or, quote, moronic. If it's a private, voluntary choice, it's protected.
Absolutely. And this whole section really hinges on identifying what they call the coercion threshold. We've established that private choice is sacrosanct in this view. So the problem, therefore, begins precisely when the government steps in, when it applies pressure or implicit threats or explicit mandates and coercion to those private companies, forcing them to enforce certain censorship or association rules.
Okay, so if the state passes a law forcing a bakery to make a specific cake, or if, say, a government official makes a phone call threatening an investigation, unless YouTube takes down certain content, that's the moment a voluntary choice becomes a forced mandate. And that's where liberty is violated according to this source.
That is the exact point of inflection, yes. The source argues that regulatory power, especially when it's wielded as a threat, essentially transforms private business decisions into extensions of state control. The power imbalance just ensures compliance, turning what might look like private disassociation into government-backed coercion.
Right. We absolutely have to move now to what is probably the most difficult and certainly the most controversial application of this principle. Section 4, the radical stance on forced association and civil rights. Okay, this section requires exceptional care from us. We are reporting directly on a viewpoint here that challenges some of the most fundamental social progress in American legal history. The source takes an extremely radical stance against any form of government-imposed integration.
This is definitely where the source applies its principles with the absolute strictest, most uncompromising consistency. It prioritizes that anti-coercion principle above literally any desired social outcome. Rose makes the argument that the core principle of liberty, the right to choose who you associate with, has to hold true even if the consequence of that choice is discrimination.
And the source specifically takes aim at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We need to state clearly and impartially exactly what the author argues here.
Okay. The author argues that the Civil Rights Act was immoral. Now, let's be very clear. The argument presented is not that the goal of eliminating racial discrimination was wrong. The argument is about the mechanism used to enforce it.
It's a structural argument.
Exactly, it's structural. The act mandated that private businesses had to engage in transactions and associations they didn't necessarily choose, thereby forcing integration. In the author's view, this act of forced association is symmetrically problematic to the era of government-mandated segregation, which was forced disassociation. Both, in this view, rely on state force to dictate private behavior. So the goal of equality, according to this really radical framework, does not justify violating what they see as the fundamental right to choose one's own business associates.
That is a critical philosophical distinction the source is making. It's crucial we understand it's not presented as a defense of racism itself, but as a defense of the principle of non-coercion, arguing that using state force, even for what many see as noble ends, fundamentally compromises liberty.
It is entirely about the means, not the ends, for this author. The source sees any government mandate that dictates association, whether it's promoting separation or promoting integration, as an equal violation of private liberty. That symmetry is absolutely key to understanding how the source then applies this to modern debates, under the heading the right to refuse service, sometimes called the bake the cake doctrine.
Right, so the source argues that whether the refusal to do business is based on racist views, or hateful views, or just political disagreement, the right of the individual or the business owner to refuse service must be absolutely protected from government interference.
Absolutely. And to show how consistently they believe this principle should be applied, the source applies the logic symmetrically to both sides of the modern culture war.
Okay, let's start with the more conservative alliance scenario people often discuss.
Detail 1. The source argues that a religious bakery refusing to make a cake for a gay wedding is exercising its fundamental freedom of association and, potentially, expression. The government cannot compel that owner's labor or force them to express a message they object to. If the state were to step in and fine the bakery or try to shut it down, that, in this view, is coercion. plain and simple.
Okay. And the mirror image, the liberal refusal.
Detail 2. Symmetrically, the source argues that, say, a progressive printer who refuses to make flyers for a conservative political rally is also within their rights. Just like the conservative baker, the liberal printer cannot be forced by the state to engage in an association or express speech they object to. The principle, they insist, must hold consistently, regardless of whose ox is gored.
This really emphasizes the source's core commitment here to the principle over outcome. The doctrine doesn't allow for exceptions based on whether we, or society, deem the social outcome of the refusal offensive or perhaps justifiable.
That is the absolute core takeaway. The source argues the only acceptable libertarian response to offensive or hateful behavior should be things like criticism, condemnation, boycott using voluntary market forces to punish the offending party. Government force is never acceptable, even when the business refusal is based on views that are repugnant to the vast majority. To bring in the state, according to this document, is to violate the very liberty you might claim you're trying to defend.
So just to be crystal clear, if a hotel owner refuses to rent a room based on race, the community response, according to this source, must be purely voluntary. Maybe a massive, organized, sustained boycott, public condemnation. Maybe they lose business partners, people refuse to patronize them. But the state cannot step in and mandate service. That is the fundamental and, yes, deeply radical line drawn by this philosophy.
It is. It's a philosophy that places infinite trust in social pressure and market forces, however harsh or slow they might be, compared to zero trust in the coercive power of the state.
Which makes the shift to talking about covert government power even more interesting. It suggests the government often tries to achieve indirectly what it maybe can't legislate overtly. Let's move to Section 5, mafia-style government coercion. Okay, so we've established the limits of liberty, the absolute prohibition on explicit state force in this framework. Now, this final section shifts focus to what the source sees as maybe the most insidious threat, this covert government interference. The author actually labels it mafia-style coercion. That suggests subtle, implicit threats of state power, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the idea. The author defines mafia-style coercion as using the implicit threat of state regulatory power, or maybe future adverse action, to influence private decisions without ever passing a formal law or issuing a direct order. It relies entirely on the fear of potential future action. You know, the possibility of a targeted audit, sudden regulatory hurdles popping up, or maybe unfavorable investigations down the line.
So we're talking about powerful figures making maybe pointed phone calls or implying consequences or issuing these vague public statements that businesses just know they'd better not ignore.
Precisely. The source details an example they claim involved the Trump administration, the Walmart tariff example. The claim is that Donald Trump allegedly pressured Walmart not to publicly disclose the expected price increases that would result from new tariffs on Chinese goods. Now, according to the source, this wasn't a written mandate from the Treasury Department. It was, allegedly, the implicit threat of state power, the potential for targeted regulatory action, maybe unfavorable treatment on future trade issues, or licensing used to influence a private business decision about transparency and pricing strategy.
That's a really fascinating mechanism of control, isn't it? The business complies not because they agree, but because the potential cost of non-compliance, getting into a drawn-out regulatory fight with the White House, is just exponentially higher than the cost of simply doing what's asked. The government doesn't even need to fire a shot. They just have to subtly show the gun.
That is the absolute essence of this mafia-style coercion concept. And the source is very clear that this alleged behavior is entirely symmetrical across the political spectrum. They provide the digital censorship example, claiming that under the Biden administration, significant pressure was put on tech giants like YouTube to censor content related to the pandemic.
Can you elaborate on that claim about the digital censorship? How does the source allege this pressure was applied? Was it direct orders?
Not direct orders, no. The source alleges that high-ranking administration officials would maybe publicly denounce certain content as dangerous misinformation, and then subsequently engage in direct, but maybe off-the-record, communication with big tech CEOs or policy heads. The government doesn't issue a formal subpoena. They just, make calls to executives at these huge tech companies suggesting certain content is problematic, knowing full well that these companies operate in an environment where they're constantly under threat of antitrust investigations, FTC regulation, or unfavorable new legislation.
So the company complies, essentially, to avoid potential regulatory warfare down the line, effectively outsourcing the censorship the government wants but maybe can't legally mandate. And the author maintains some of his own material, which he claims was accurate, got removed because of this kind of systemic pressure.
That is the specific claim made in the document, yes. It analyzes this by saying businesses comply not because they share the government's ideology or because it's a genuine voluntary choice, but purely out of fear of government retaliation from powerful agencies like the Department of Justice or the FTC. This systemic regulatory fear, the source argues, turns these alleged voluntary choices like removing controversial videos or avoiding politically sensitive statements into a form of coercion that the author views as basically indistinguishable from a direct state mandate.
So the source is arguing that both the Trump administration allegedly influencing Walmart's pricing disclosure via tariff threats and the Biden administration allegedly influencing content moderation via regulatory threats both are equally guilty of violating this core principle of unrestricted liberty.
Yes, they are seen as unified by the same mechanism, the use of implicit state power to manipulate the private sphere. If a politician or a government official acts to suppress speech or association they dislike, whether they do it via an explicit law, like the Civil Rights Act in the author's controversial view, or via an implicit threat, like pressuring Walmart or YouTube, the end result, according to this framework, is exactly the same, the violation of unrestricted liberty.
Wow. This has been a really necessary, but deeply challenging look into a framework that's built on just ruthless consistency.
Let's try and finish by synthesizing the hypocrisy that the author identifies across the whole political landscape.
Yeah. The source is absolutely unwavering in its final message on this. It claims that both the political left and the political right are fundamentally hypocritical when it comes to liberty. They'll fiercely, vociferously defend free speech, but only when it protects their specific side or helps them advance their specific message.
But the absolute moment they are the ones offended or challenged or feel threatened by a dissenting viewpoint, they immediately pivot. They start demanding censorship or government intervention or regulatory pressure to silence the opposition.
The author seems to be demanding this kind of ideological consistency that feels, well, almost impossible to achieve in a real-world democracy that's fueled by passion and genuinely opposing beliefs. If this level of inconsistency is just inherent, what does the author actually define as peaceful coexistence? How can we live together?
Rose's definition of peaceful coexistence is surprisingly minimal. It's extremely low DAR, actually. It's defined simply as not resorting to violence or state coercion. That's it. That is the full extent of the social contract required by this doctrine. It doesn't require harmony. It doesn't require agreement or mutual respect or shared values, nothing like that. It's described as a purely transactional state where individuals and groups might utterly despise each other, ridicule each other, condemn each other, but they fundamentally agree on one thing: not to physically attack each other or use the power of the state against each other.
That sounds like an extraordinarily noisy, maybe chaotic, but structurally very free environment. It seems to rely on an almost superhuman level of tolerance for offensive expression.
It absolutely does. Which brings us right to the ultimate takeaway for the learner, for you listening. For this source, true liberty requires you to recognize that other people possess the absolute right to say and do things that you personally deem stupid, offensive, or maybe even hateful. The price of liberty in this view is tolerating the intolerable and accepting that the only permissible punishment comes through voluntary, private, social, and economic consequences, never the state.
And that leads us perfectly to a final provocative thought for you to maybe explore on your own, something that pushes just a bit beyond the source material itself into the reality of our 21st century lives.
Yeah, the author draws this absolute unyielding line between state coercion forbidden and social consequence, like criticism, boycotts, firing allowed. But what happens to peaceful coexistence when the power of social condemnation itself may be fueled by massive coordinated social media campaigns, amplified by algorithms, spread by instantaneous information sharing, becomes so overwhelmingly destructive, so totalizing, that it actually feels like coercion? Is that line between purely social consequence and state force always perfectly clear in a completely networked society? A society where the collective will of the online network can potentially ruin someone faster and maybe more effectively than the government ever could.
Something to chew on as you navigate the noise of modern life. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into unrestricted liberty. We'll see you next time.